MV Sewol. History. Disaster struck the South Korean ferry known as the MV Sewol on April 16, 2014 after an illegal redesign of the vessel was completed in 2012. First, let's get into some background information regarding the ship's history. The ferry's original name was Naminue, and under that name it operated from 1994 to 2012 as a transport ship for passengers and cargo. At the time, it was owned by the Japanese company A-Line Ferry, and they had zero issues with the ship during its service in Japan. On October 8, 2012, the ferry was sold to the Chonghae-jin Marine Company, and that's when the ferry came to be known as the MV Sewol. After its 18 years of service, the ferry was worn out and completely dilapidated, since nothing on board had been repaired before it was purchased. In order to get the ship back to tip-top shape, modifications were completed to the ferry between October 12, 2012 to February 12, 2013. Later, it was found out that the changes were based on an illegal redesign of the vessel, which could have contributed to the sinking of the ship in 2014. The modifications included the addition of 2 decks for passengers, as well as the expansion of the cargo space. Originally, the ship was built to hold 239 tons, but after its redesign, it was then able to carry 6,825 tons of cargo. The passenger limit also increased from 116 people to a total of 956 people, including crew members on board the ship. These changes resulted in the ferry's center of gravity being moved upward by 0.51 meters, and it also led to a left-right imbalance as well. After the vessel was finished, an investigation was completed by the Korean Register of Shipping, KR. They did a number of tests to make sure the ship was sea-ready, including an inclining test. This is performed to determine the boat's light ship weight, stability, and the coordinates of its center of gravity. The ferry was determined to be safe, and it received the ship certification as well as the certification of the prevention of sea pollution in early 2013. Although MV Sewol was certified, the KR had to reduce the maximum cargo limit to 987 tons for safety reasons, and the amount of ballast needed was increased to 1,703 tons to help with the ship's stability. After that, everything seemed to be in order. However, the Korea Shipping Association and the Korea Coast Guard (KSAG) were not informed of the ferry's cargo limit. In a shocking twist, the Board of Audit and Inspection revealed later that the KR's licensing had been based on falsified documents. Further analysis was then completed, and as a result, an additional 37 tons of marble were added to the ferry's gallery room at the bridge deck, which is located on the back of the ship. When the final modifications were completed, legally this time, the ship was ready to hit the open water. On March 15, 2013, Sewol began its first operation. Every week from then on, the vessel completed 3 round trips from Incheon to Jeju, with each one-way voyage being 425 kilometers, taking a total of 13.5 hours to finish. In February of the next year, an interim inspection as well as a periodic inspection from the register was completed, and they were given the all-clear to continue their regularly scheduled routes. Although the register may have glossed over a couple of things because the disaster happened only 2 months later. Would you rather sail around the world or pilot a plane flying around the world? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Disaster strikes, April 2014. On April 15, 2014, Sewol was supposed to leave the Incheon port at about 6:30 p.m. However, a dense fog had rolled in, restricting the crew's visibility to less than 1 kilometer. Only an hour before they were set to depart, the Incheon Vessel Traffic Service (VTS) issued a low visibility warning, consequently halting Sewol's departure time. Just a few hours later, about 8:30 p.m., the VTS retracted its warning, and after the weather conditions were checked by the Shipping Association, KCG, and the operator of the Palmito Lighthouse, the restrictions were removed and the ferry was able to leave the port at 9 p.m. that evening. When Sewol set out on its final voyage, there were a total of 33 crew members, 443 passengers, and a whopping 2,142.7 tons of cargo, including 185 cars on board the vessel. Sadly, 325 of the passengers were students from Danwon High School on a field trip, and 5 of them were not of Korean nationality. The ship's captain that day was brought in as a replacement for the regular captain. However, he had over 40 years of experience at sea and had apparently traveled this route many times before. He was 69-year-old Lee Jun-suk and had been hired on with a 1-year contract and a monthly salary of about $2,500. It's important to note that of the 33 crew members that day, 19 of them were only part-time workers and did not have experience aboard this specific ferry. At 7:30 a.m. on April 16th, the ferry's third mate Park Han-kyul and Chu Jun-ki, the helmsman, took over the watch and relieved the previous team. The seawall at the time was heading at a course of around 165 degrees and a speed of about 20 knots. The ship was operating 2 radar devices, and when it was only a couple of miles from entering the Mengol Channel, Cho was ordered by Park to change from autopilot to manual steering. At a course of 137 degrees, seawall entered the channel and everything seemed normal. The wind speed was between 4 and 7 meters per second, there were no problems with visibility, and the wave height was only about 0.5 meters. Although the conditions were good, the Mengol Channel has strong underwater currents, which require extreme caution when steering a vessel through it. Seawall was following a frequently used route, and based on a report from the Korean Maritime Safety Tribunal, Park had passed through this channel on multiple occasions while on another ship. The wider areas of this channel contained shallow waters and rock hazards. However, they were not supposed to be in the immediate vicinity of the ferry's usual path. Right before disaster struck, breakfast was being served in the ship's cafeteria, and CCTV footage showed students socializing on the deck. Chua Yun-sun, a surviving passenger of the incident, recalled going up to the deck to smoke just before everything happened. The captain was missing from the bridge at the time of the incident. At 8:46 a.m., under orders from Park, Cho changed the course of the ship from 130 degrees to 140 degrees. According to Park's testimony, she then used the radar to confirm that the course had been changed, and then ordered Cho to change course even further to 145 degrees, which would later have devastating consequences. Unfortunately, the vessel began heavily listing to starboard, which in turn caused the bow to turn to the right. Park then told Cho to turn the wheel to port. And in a flustered voice, Cho said, "The wheel isn't working." Immediately after, the entire ship started listing. The Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries analysis of Seawall's track chart revealed that the Automatic Identification System (AIS) had stopped collecting data due to a reported power outage on board. And the expert advisory panel, part of the Police Prosecution Joint Investigation Team, said the AIS failure was due to system limitations, but it did not affect the steering of the ship. On this fateful day, Seawall was heavily overloaded, and combined with the steering error, the sharp turn was too much for the ship. The extra cargo was not secured tightly enough, and once the vessel listed 20 degrees into the water, all of that cargo then fell to that side of the ferry, only making matters worse. At this time, the ship's gyroscope began to record angular velocity starting at 15 dps, damage per second, dropping to 14 dps the next second, and reportedly minus 11 dps the following second. The passengers heard a loud bang, and because the cargo had shifted, it greatly contributed to the destabilizing of the vessel. The ship then tilted another 10 degrees into the water. Overall, Seawall was turned about 45 degrees to the right and then rotated an additional 22 degrees for a span of 20 seconds, leading to catastrophic results. The cargo falling to one side of the ship only caused it to further lose its restoring force, and water began flowing into the vessel through the cargo loading bay's side door, as well as the car entrance at the stern. Off-duty helmsman Oh Young-suk was awakened from his slumber when he was thrown against his cabin's port side as a result of the ship's tilt, which was now leaning a total of 30 degrees to port. Captain Lee at the time was still in his private cabin. When he was informed of the incident, he rushed to the bridge in order to take control. Soon after he arrived, the remaining shipmates and helmsmen made their way to the bridge as well to help in any way they could. Shortly after, the ship's engines were turned off by Cho, although it's unclear if this was done by orders from Lee or out of his own volition. The assistant engineer was called to evacuate the engine room, and with the engines off, Seawall was unable to change directions and began to shift even further sideways. Passengers also testified that the lights had gone out on the vessel shortly after the ferry began to list. Announcements to the crew and passengers began broadcasting at around 8:52 a.m., and everyone was told to stay put, since moving around on the sinking ship was dangerous. Communication officer Kang Hae-sung, who was making the announcements, apparently did not consult the manual before he began barking orders, and continued to tell everyone to remain where they were even when water began to flood passenger compartments. Captain Lee allegedly upheld the orders to stay put, even when he himself was leaving the ship. Emergency calls from Seawall's passengers and crew members began flooding the National Emergency Service line and patrol boats, and the helicopters were deployed in order to aid in the rescue mission. Those on board were then ordered to put on life jackets, but were still told to stay in their cabins. At 9:33 a.m., the Vessel Traffic Service (VTS) told all of the nearby ships that had volunteered to help to drop lifeboats for Seawall's passengers. And at 9:38 a.m., all communications were cut off between the ferry and the VTS. It was reported that only 3 minutes after communications were terminated, 150 to 160 crew and passengers jumped overboard in an attempt to save their own lives. The ship took about 2.5 hours to fully sink. By 11:18 a.m., the stern was fully submerged, and by 1:03 p.m., Seawall was no longer visible and was completely under the water. As a result of the ship capsizing, there were a total of 299 deaths from those on board, as well as 2 rescue divers and 5 emergency workers. Salvage operations. Seawall was not salvaged until March of 2017. The Shanghai Salvage Company, a Chinese consortium, was contracted by the Korean government to carry out the operation. Nearly 40 meters below the water, the ship was lying on its port side. All of the ferry's cabins were sealed shut, and oil and diesel were drained so as not to contaminate the area further. Massive fences were then constructed around the vessel to prevent any of the wreckage from floating away. A crane able to carry the weight of the ship was used to lift the bow of the seawall 5 degrees, and then 33 lifting beams were placed underneath it. A salvage crew pumped water out from inside the vessel's ballast tanks and then attached airbags to greatly increase the buoyancy of the ferry. ALE, a UK company specializing in heavy lifting and transport, were also utilized in the complex operation in the East China Sea. When it was pulled from the water using multiple self-propelled modular transporters (SPMT), the ship weighed a record-breaking 17,000 tons. The salvage operation was followed on-site by the Korean government as well as the families of the victims, which put extra pressure on the ALE team in charge of the mission. Before the ferry was moved, it was only estimated to weigh around 11,000 to 13,000 tons. However, it was basically impossible to confirm the exact weight until it was lifted out of the water and positioned onto the giant barge to bring it back to shore. Cables attached to lifting beams and strand jacks slowly lifted the ship to 13 meters below the surface, and it was then connected to the barge. Seawall was towed and then carefully loaded onto a semi-submersible vessel before it was transported back to shore using SPMTs, where ALE was able to unload the ship. A significant amount of mud was still inside the ferry, which increased the overall weight of the vessel by 4,000 tons. As a result, ALE had to re-engineer a loadout solution with their site engineering team. Because of this, the amount of axles used in the operation increased from 456 to 600 axle lines at very short notice. Due to the unpredictable deformations of the cargo, the extreme damages to the ferry's superstructures and hull, as well as the ship's transport position, the transporting phase was extremely challenging for the ALE team. However, a careful and accurate shimming tuning phase prior to the load transfer allowed ALE to perform the load-in operation successfully. At the time of the salvage, there were still 9 passengers unaccounted for. The team on site retrieved the remains of teacher Go Chang-suk, as well as Dongwon High School students Lee Yong-suk, Hye Da-yoon, and Cho Yun-hwa. However, 5 years after the initial sinking of the ship, only partial remains were found, and DNA testing was used in order to identify them. Search operations were completed on October 19, 2018, and 5 victims are still missing today. Would you jump overboard if you were on a ship that was sinking? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.